Thank you, Kelly. As I look at the run sheet here, it says 6 p.m, lights to dim. Light on speaker to come on. We are only 1 minute late, so I'm not in too much trouble yet. Look, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this, the third presentation in the series of RBWH history, or the history series. Look, my name is Peter Buttram and I'm your MC this evening. I'm currently on the RBWH Alumni Committee, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here as we celebrate, going into next year, 150 years of history of the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. Keeping in mind, for 135 of those years, we had no such thing as a mobile phone. So can I just make sure that everyone's got their phones turned down or put away, so as not to disturb anyone tonight? Touch wood, I'm okay in that respect. Look, a big thank you to everyone who's here tonight. It's a terrific turnout, and thank you to all those who have travelled and all those who have come back to join us after a little while away. Looking down the front here to our speakers, look, thank you very much. Alanna Geary, we'll hear from Alanna soon. Professor Joan Webster, we look forward to hearing all about the research here, Joan. And also, thank you, Elaine. It only seems like yesterday that we were right outside the door here toasting your 28 years here at the Royal Brisbane Hospital when you left us a few years ago. So thank you very much for coming back and talking to us tonight. Finally, I'd also like to thank our sponsors, and certainly our gold sponsors for the Royal Alumni, and that is Q Super and Q Bank. Thank you very much for your ongoing support. It enables us to host events such as this evening. And so we're here tonight, of course, to unearth some more fascinating and pioneering history in the third part of our history series. Being the oldest and largest hospital in Queensland, the Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital has employed thousands or tens of thousands of doctors, nurses, allied health professionals, midwives, researchers, administration staff, interns, and all sorts of people that help to make this place and this campus run. Within the hospital's 150 year anniversary coming up next year, it's a great time and an opportune time to bring everybody together, past and present staff and students, under the auspices of the Royal Alumni. We hope to share, I guess, this history with our alumni and with our community, and talking about all the history that's taken place on the campus, and to have the people that laid the foundation for us to create the world-class institution that the Royal is today. So look, with that introduction out of the way, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Elaine Unkles, who said to keep it as brief as possible. A little difficult, Elaine. Elaine was the director here at the Royal from 1984 to 2011. 28 wonderful years. And as director, Elaine worked tirelessly to raise the profile of physiotherapy, but also more broadly all the allied health professions within the hospital. She led the growth and expansion of things like physiotherapy into clinical areas, such as the lymphedema service, and I see one of our esteemed lymphedema physiotherapists here tonight, the Department of Emergency Medicine, orthopaedic screening clinics, and the amputee outreach services. Elaine vigorously promoted and sponsored research, and after 10 years of dogged persistence, she secured funding for the appointment in 2002 of the inaugural co-joint physiotherapy research fellowship with the University of Queensland. And my understanding, that was probably the first in its state, certainly by a long way for any of the allied health professions. She subsequently secured a joint research position soon after with Griffith University. Elaine was instrumental here at the hospital in establishing the occupational rehabilitation unit and the manual handling programs, and also the planning of the first purpose-built physiotherapy department in the history of the hospital. And I think, Elaine, one of your legacies will be of real estate developer, because that department is still in many ways the envy of everyone else around the hospital, with your foresight to what was required for the future. Known for her remarkable commitment, advocacy and leadership, Elaine has been an excellent role model for all professionals, and certainly physiotherapists, by demonstrating her own dedication to quality patient care and lifelong learning. In 2007, Elaine was recognised with a Medal of the Order of Australia, OAM, for her service to physiotherapy and health administration. and to the commitment through her work with the Wesley Mission Brisbane. She was recognised by the RBWH in 2009 with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Elaine's presentation tonight will cover the first 80 years of physiotherapy on the campus here at the Royal, and it is a story of the emergence of a new profession and the challenges it was faced with during those years. Please welcome Elaine Unkles. It was very short, Elaine. There you go. And that's yours too.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk about the history of physiotherapy at the Royal Brisbane Hospital. I received a letter from Professor Tara in 1991 saying he had now reached the period from 1975 and would like any information I had on the Department of Physiotherapy. As you will hear tonight, quite a lot happened before 1975. In the time I have available, I have chosen to concentrate on roughly the first 80 years, as there were a number of things that happened around 1980 which provided new opportunities for change and explains where the physiotherapy service is today. I will generally not be citing the source. I think I've gone one too far, sorry. I will generally not be citing the source of the information I'm presenting, but I'm happy to provide that to anyone interested for a specific fact. I would be delighted to hear from anyone who has more information or identifies any inaccuracies in what I have to say. I will be using the abbreviation AMA throughout. It was this Australasian Massage Association which was formed in 1906 through to 1939 when it was replaced by the Australian Physiotherapy Association. Prior to becoming the more well-known AMA in 1962, the Australian Medical Association was known as the BMA, the British Medical Association in Australia. This is just a quick review of the names of the three hospitals on this site. I mention all three of these because for a considerable part of this time, they were under the control of the same board. There were, of course, a number of different boards as well, and so I'll probably just use the term hospital board as I go through. Before I can talk about the history of physiotherapy, I need to explain the origin of the profession in Australia. A definition of physiotherapy or physical therapy is a good place to start because at its simplest, it is the use of physical methods to treat disorders of movement, which are the result of changes in the neuromusculoskeletal system caused by pathology, trauma, or natural processes, such as ageing and childbirth. The early physical methods used included massage, exercise on land and in water, hot and cold, and all had been around from the earliest times of recorded history. Just so you can guess where that is, if you get bored with what I say. Early colonial Australia in the 19th century apparently provided a social and physical environment that fostered a wealth of alternative health practice and dubious practitioners, including medical men providing remedies which were of little value to the health and well-being of the populace. However, there were three which were of some benefit, and these were massage, medical gymnastics, and electrotherapy. In Victoria in the 1890s, there were two well-known masseurs who were very well connected socially and with the medical profession, one of whom went on to be very influential in the formation of the Australasian Massage Association. But the change that occurred in the 1890s was that gentlewomen started acquiring skills in massage, which they used to help patients in hospitals who were often confined to bed for very long periods. Why this apparently sudden blossoming of women being involved in providing these treatments, which up until then had been the province of men? It was no doubt a sign of the times that women were starting to break down the gender barriers which prevented them from voting, from enjoying the same legal rights as men, and from studying medicine. It's been recorded that a Miss Eliza Macaulay found she could achieve some therapeutic results in massage and was allowed to enter the anatomy course of the Melbourne University with the first 2 female medical students in Victoria in 1891. It is possible that massage therapists had been employed in the major hospitals of Melbourne, Sydney and Adelaide from the late 1890s, and certainly in 1906, the Melbourne Hospital appointed 5 masseurs and 10 masseuses. The medical superintendent of the Brisbane Hospital from 1883 to 1898, and subsequently a visiting surgeon, Dr. Sanford Jackson, was a graduate of the University of Melbourne. Perhaps he was aware of developments in Victoria when he decided to train nurses in massage. Articles written about the history of physiotherapy have not recorded whether this initiative resulted in the establishment of massage department at that time. At the Royal Brisbane. By 1906, the first meeting of the AMA was held in Melbourne, which aimed to obtain registration of recognised masseurs, establish a uniform system of training, and promote the interests of members of the association. There were no Queensland representatives, but 12 months later, after the Brisbane branch of the BMA appointed a subcommittee to form a Queensland branch of the AMA, there were 12 members in Queensland and 302 Australia-wide, plus 196 honorary medical members. One of the rules of the AMA was that members undertook not to treat or accept work except under the direction of a registered medical practitioner, and no member could advertise except in an approved manner. This was to ensure that there was no confusion with the less salubrious establishment where massage was offered, and also to give the profession added respectability. This ethical principle was not repealed until 1976. The association was strongly supported by various medical practitioners, particularly orthopaedic surgeons, and these medical men presided over the association right through to 1972. As an aside, the literature consistently refers to medical practitioners as medical men, right up to at least the 1950s and probably later. It's interesting to note that despite the gendered character of the health professions at that time, men were doctors and women were nurses, there were both male and female massage therapists, although there was a predominance of women who were trained massage therapists in the early years. The presence of men in the profession was unusual, and this caused problems for the army during the war as to how to cope with this with regard to what rank they held and what their pay should be. The following years were difficult because of World War I and polio epidemics. During World War I, a military massage unit was established and 50 AMA members were recruited for service at home and abroad, in England and Egypt. This caused shortages at home, but it did enable a cross-fertilisation of knowledge amongst the masseurs from the different countries. The war certainly raised the profile of massage and the cause of rehab in general, and orthopaedics in particular. There was definitely a massage department at the Brisbane Hospital in the early 1920s, and it may well have been the continuing needs of the war wounded which established a department if it wasn't already in existence. One of the staff, a Mr. Laird, may have been part of the Army Medical Services, or he may have been trained post-war as he was blind. And he was still on the staff in 1944 and was an active member of the Queensland branch of the association. The minutes of the Queensland branch of the AMA are held by the APA, and they're from 1924. And they state that there were only 3 hospitals in Brisbane which employed masseurs at that time. This was the Brisbane Hospital, the Hospital for Sick Children, and the Mater Hospital. The minutes throughout the 1920s record the concern of members of the lack of uniformity of salary and conditions of the hospital massage staffs. In 1927, the Brisbane Hospital had granted a pay increase to the massage staff from £275 to $300 per annum. The secretary of the AMA was instructed to write to the Mater Hospital, asking that the Mater Hospital staff could have the same salary and conditions. This was successful. Queensland Nurses Association was formed in 1921, and that same year was granted an industrial award, but this doesn't seem to have encouraged the AMA to do the same. But perhaps their small numbers and their usually successful ad hoc approach with the respective boards made it not a viable proposition. As well, in the 1920s, the AMA's energies were more directed to seeking registration of the profession and the establishment of a training course in Queensland. The two were closely connected, and the AMA had the support of the BMA and the hospital board for both these goals. Registration was achieved in 1928 with the promulgation of the Nurses and Masseurs Registration Act, perhaps made easier to progress because it had already been achieved in Victoria in 1922, and there was another public polio epidemic. All other states had to wait until after World War II. While there were courses in other states, by the 1920s there was no course in Queensland, and at the AGM of the AMA in July 1927, the President raised the question of the advisability of establishing a training school for massage in Brisbane at the Queensland University. This was the most interesting development, as no other course in Australia resided wholly within a university. The first record held by University of Queensland that education of physiotherapists was discussed was in December 1927, and it was followed on from an approach by the Brisbane and South Coast Hospitals Board, possibly because they were concerned by the shortage of masseurs to cope with the polio epidemics. A meeting which followed resulted in the formation of a committee to progress this under the chairmanship of Professor Goddard. He was to be a great advocate for a course for massage therapists over many years. He noted at the time that the General Hospital would make available suitable facilities for practical work. There was no action for some years, possibly because of the depression, but Professor Goddard was quite keen because he was also sponsoring dental studies and the medical faculty formation, and he, even in the press, linked a massage course with the desirability of founding a medical school. In 1933, he told the AMA that he believed that a school could be opened in the next year. However, the AMA members thought it wasn't an opportune time, as there was not sufficient work to absorb all those who had been trained interstate. And they wanted the government to encourage appointment to regional hospitals, and some were concerned that their livelihood at the Brisbane Hospital would be interfered with. However, despite their concern of the Brisbane Hospital staff that the jobs were at risk, discussions did continue. And in 1936, there was a meeting of the AMA in which they discussed whether or not the electrical apparatus of the Brisbane Hospital would be brought up to date so that electricity in all its branches could be taught to the students. The department at the General Hospital, they were told, could be brought up to date with no great expenditure, and this without doubt would be done by the time the students were ready to commence their electrical course. Dr. Crawford, who was the president of the AMA at the time and subsequently went on to head up the school, he also thought that it would be possible for the students to do pool work at Montrose until the General Hospital had its own pool. It was another 40 years before there was a pool at the RBH. And certainly in the 1960s and 70s, the university provided the electrotherapy equipment, since the hospital had very little of its own. Sorry, I'll go back. I think I've missed out something, sorry. No, something's gone miss, doesn't matter. A 3-year diploma in physiotherapy was approved by the University Senate in February 1938, and 16 students started that same year. They were to have had accommodation in Edward Street, but the university sought the aid of the hospital board for space at the General Hospital. Hospital space then, as ever, was under great pressure, and the accommodation for physiotherapy students was always makeshift, wherever the physiotherapy department happened to be. For 2 years, they had space in the old outpatients building at the gate on Hurston Road. Some of you will remember that building. The department then moved to 3B in 1940 in order to provide additional space for the students in the solarium for their clinical education. Later, during the war, when it seemed there might be air raids, the physiotherapy department was moved to the top floor of Block 1. And 3B was apparently used for operating theatres. This was apparently at odds with the decision of the medical superintendent, who had decided in 1941 to vacate the top floors of Blocks 1 to 4. I was told that the rationale for the move of physiotherapy up to 1F was that the physiotherapists were energetic and could get down to the ground in a hurry. And there apparently was some system of slings which could be used in an emergency. I've never found any photos of this, so I don't know. Post-war, the department returned to 3B. Those of you who are around know that was opposite the kitchens. And the students returned to the solarium for their clinical experience. And then when the department moved to 2A in 1972, they moved to the veranda of 2A, of the old ward. This was the beginning of a long association with the University of Queensland, from which the hospital benefited greatly, as the university provided staff to supervise the students on clinical placement, and the students undertook a substantial clinical load. Between the two world wars, the major field was the treatment of patients with polio, as the epidemic followed epidemic. Professor Tyre cites 128 cases of polio at the Hospital for Sick Children in 1931-32, 69 of whom were paralysed. And this extract, I hope, from the paper, tells what in fact happened at the General. The big news is that the staff was increased by 50% at the beginning of 1932. Conventional treatment for polio at the time involved enforcing strict immobilisation during the acute and convalescent phase with standardised splints and Bradford frames to which children were strapped, sometimes for months, and when they became mobile, they wore cumbersome and heavy leg braces. The rationale was to try to prevent the gross deformities which occur with polio because of the muscle imbalance. The children were taken out of the splints for exercise by the masseurs. Into this scenario came Sister Kenny. Her method involved moist hot compresses to ease muscle pain, eliminating immobilisation during the acute phase of the disease, and forcible movements when exercising the paralysed muscles. There was considerable disquiet amongst medical practitioners and the masseurs over her methods because of her lack of knowledge of anatomy and pathology, and therefore no theoretical basis, and her non-acknowledgement of spontaneous recovery. Throughout the 1930s, the AMA minutes report the concerns of the members, the first reference being made in late 1933. The Royal Commission was subsequently established, but despite the findings of the Royal Commission in 1938, it didn't happen quickly, that they could not recommend her method of treatment, the government went ahead and established a Kenny Clinic at the General in 1939, and this is the building across the road from the Education Centre where the alumni office is. One can only imagine the sense of betrayal that was experienced by the staff at the General. Part of the frustration, I believe, was the lack of recognition of what the hospital staff was already doing, and that they were not being given the same resources and staff that Sister Kenny was being given by the government. Sister Kenny had no formal training, while they had all completed a 2 or 3 year diploma. She had no real understanding of the pathology of the condition, but was an excellent self-publicist who made outrageous claims on the effectiveness of her treatment. In retrospect, however, several physiotherapists who worked in the 1940s have said to me that she broke down the old conservative methods of long-term splinting, and she stirred people up to prove that she was wrong. In addition to polio, though, there were new types of injuries from motor vehicle accidents, industrial accidents, and even sporting injuries. And physiotherapists were moving into maternity, thoracic surgery, and psychiatric care. With the outbreak of World War II, the physiotherapists were in all three services, and by 1941 were serving in the Middle East, Malaya, England, and Australia. And again, there were grave shortages of staff in Australia. The hospital staff were concerned very early about what would happen when these physiotherapists returned, and a special general meeting of the AMA was held in November 1939 to discuss the war emergency plan. It was resolved that all hospital appointments shall be returned after military discharge has been granted, and boards of different hospitals were requested to grant leave of absence. An interesting footnote to the war years comes from the minutes of the AMA, when the president at that time, again still Dr. Crawford, said this. I get a chuckle every time I read this, and I will let you read it, but it was one of the funny things for me that happened during the Second World War. I don't know whether it applied to the surgical diathermy machines or not. Industrial matters raised their head again in March 1944, at the same time as the RMOs were challenging the board with their working conditions. And the AMA received a letter from Miss Mowbray, who was head of the department here, on behalf of senior physiotherapists at the General Hospital in the matter of salaries and conditions of service. It seems that their salary was now £200, a significant reduction from what they were getting in the 1920s, and there were no increments. A few months later, the newly graduated physiotherapists at the General Hospital took matters into their own hands and made application directly to the board for an increase in salary. Letters between the APA and the hospital board continued through to 1946, when 20 physiotherapists employed in the hospitals made a submission at their own expense to the arbitration court. This was not successful, but another attempt was made in 1947 when 21 physiotherapists, including General Hospital staff, contributed £1 each to present a case to the Arbitration Commission, and this was successful with the establishment of the Physiotherapists Award State. Bearing in mind that they were only receiving £200 per year before tax, this was a considerable amount that they gave for this. OTs and speeches subsequently benefited from this when they began to be employed in the 1960s. In 1945, physiotherapists were working a 40-hour week, but shortly after this, it was reduced to 35.5 hours a week by the hospital board. It appears to have had something to do with not being allowed access to the wards in the middle of the day. Even in 1945, experienced physiotherapists were providing an on-call service as required, and staff were also rostered to work on Saturday mornings, with a half day off in the next week. I started work in 1966. There was still a differential between male and female staff salaries, and women had to cease work as government employees when they married. The annual salary at that time was £1,182 per annum, so it had gone up since the 1940s. Some 30 years later, a new award called the Physiotherapists, Occupational Therapists and Speech Therapists Public Hospital Board and Queensland Radium Institute Award State came into effect, with a starting salary of $8,446 per annum. And at last they got increments. There were 6. But it wasn't until a couple of years later that they were given titled positions of in charge, and then subsequently a new category of senior physiotherapists. But at Royal Brisbane, this was not advertised until 1984. The scope of physiotherapy widened considerably during the war years. Much work was carried out with orthopaedic patients, particularly those with gunshot wounds and nerve injuries. Essential treatment was given to those with chest wounds and to many requiring plastic surgery. Following the war, the use of a rehab team, which had gradually developed in the forces, grew. With the introduction of the Salk vaccine in 1954, there were no longer polio epidemics, and while there was a continued need for ongoing treatment of children who had had polio, hospital staff did have time to treat other patients with movement disabilities. Post-war, new methods of treatment for neurological patients were being developed, which utilised the neuroplasticity of the brain to regain movement and function. These new methods include the Bovarth approach, Rude's sensory-motor approach, and Cabot and Knott's proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. There was little evidence of its use at the General, as staffing was so tight there was no adequate space to treat patients safely. The benefits of early rehab were largely ignored. In 1949, Professor Tyre records that the hospital board noted that they had 1,251 patients for what was 850 beds. I was a student in the 60s when the number of beds was still excessive, despite the opening of Prince Charles and PA, and remembered the crowded wards with additional beds wherever there was any floor space. As a physiotherapy student, it made mobilising patients very difficult. Looking back, I was surprised to learn that the number of physiotherapists at the General in 1955 was only 16.5, and there was no further increase until 1970. These 16.5 provided services to the Children's Hospital and the Women's Hospital, although during this period there was some increase in staffing for the Children's Hospital. When PA and Prince Charles were built in the 1950s, at least 2 physiotherapists working at the General Hospital were told by Miss Flower that they were to report to the respective hospitals at the appropriate time to be in charge of the physiotherapy department, although still under the direction of Miss Flower. A bit different from HR processes now. Both of them went on to stay in those positions until they retired. I have been told by staff from that time that if there were staff away at either of these hospitals, someone from the General would be put in a taxi and sent to work at that hospital. PAH had a geriatric unit for post-stroke patients and head injury patients, and Brisbane General Hospital's patients with stroke and head injuries were transferred there for their rehabilitation. But there was little time to do much while they were waiting in the ward in RBH. Patients continued to be sent for their rehab to PA and later also Prince Charles right through to the 1980s, when Geary was finally opened at Rosemount. But in 1977, when RBH had 1,057 beds and PA 1,075 beds, the physiotherapy staff for RBH was 22, while PA had 38.5. Throughout the 1950s, 60s and 70s, when the 3 hospitals were under the North Brisbane Hospitals Board, the physiotherapy departments in these hospitals were managed by Miss Flower. The Department of Health had an iron grip on resources, and additional staff and equipment were hard to come by. The annual budget cycle, which continued to the 90s, was for staff submissions and equipment requests to be submitted to the board once a year. Those that were supported by the board were forwarded into the Department of Health, and months later, advice was received as to whether there was any positive outcome. I am not aware of any records of submissions for staff in the 1950s, but there were many from the 1960s onwards. The first successful submission for RBH was in April 1970, They were advised that they had been given 2.5 additional staff. It was less than they had hoped for, but they were told not to apply for more, pending the newly appointed Dr. Johnson, a specialist in rheumatology and physical medicine, who would assess the needs of the physiotherapy department. A new medical specialty called physical medicine had emerged after the war, and in the late 1940s there were strong advocates for the establishment of a complete department of physical medicine at the General under the control of a specialist lecturer in physical medicine in the Faculty of Medicine at the university. In the mid-1950s, there were strongly held views about the role of the therapies, especially whether they should be run and taught by medical men as merely subservient to medicine, or whether they also had an independent role as scientific disciplines in their own right. The full-time professional members of the university physiotherapy staff not unnaturally felt that the therapies should also be as independent as possible, and then professional organisations supported this. Dr. Johnson's appointment came almost 20 years later. Things don't happen quickly necessarily here. There doesn't appear to be any evidence that Dr. Johnson impacted on the staffing levels. He was at RBH until 1982, but his vision of a rehab medicine department did result in the physiotherapy department being moved to Ward 2A in 1972 as the hub of a rehab department, which was also to include the ground floor of Block 1. No structural changes were made to Ward 2A to make it suitable for a physiotherapy department when they moved in 1972. And it wasn't until 1976 that extensions were made, including a gym and space for a potential pool, although the pool area was used for storage of equipment for a couple of years and didn't open until 1979. Adequate change rooms for the pool patients had not been included in the plan, and it wasn't until 1984 that this was rectified. The extension beyond the footprint of the ward, below of only one level, had no windows or skylights to provide natural lighting, no doubt to cut costs. The connection of the flat roof of the building to the existing building did not enable a free flow of rainwater, and for the next 10 to 15 years, the department was subject to flooding whenever there was a big storm. In addition, changes to the plumbing when renovations were done in the wards above us often resulted in blockages. And in order to cope with the frequent inundations in the reception area, an outdoor carpet was installed in the early 1980s. The area where the students were to have been given some space was instead allocated to the speech therapy department, and the students doing clinical practice were once more working in restricted conditions on the enclosed veranda. They were jokingly told it would be good practice for the working conditions in public hospitals in Queensland and in the developing world. RBH could be considered to be the cradle of physiotherapy in Queensland, as you have heard. From its earliest beginnings, there was strong support from medical practitioners, particularly orthopaedic surgeons and the BMA. Both world wars were important in showing the value of physiotherapy to the medical profession and the general public, and in the evolving realisation that rehab must start early and continue after most medical practitioners and the Department of Health have lost interest. Polio epidemics also shaped the progress of the profession. The level of staffing and the inadequate treatment space of the General made delivery of emerging treatment methods in physiotherapy difficult to implement. The industrial scene was fraught with difficulty and relied on the perseverance of individual physiotherapists joining together to get an award. Progress was often very slow. However, as we reach 1980, there is a physiotherapy department that has 42 staff across the 3 hospitals operating at RBH out of a converted ward, but certainly with much improved space. For the first time, in its existence, with an average of 25 to 30 students on placement throughout the year. So what are the changes I mentioned at the beginning that happened around 1980 and which will influence the delivery of physiotherapy at the RBWH into the 21st century? The first is in 1976, the repeal of the ethical principle of the APA, which had required a medical referral. Interestingly, there was no legal requirement for this ethic, as in the Act in Queensland, it wasn't mentioned. The separation of the 3 hospitals, each with their own board, in 1982. The appointment of a new physiotherapist in charge in 1984. And the new Goss government in 1991 changed the way funding was made available. But that is for another time. Thank you.
Look, Elaine, thank you so much. And you've always been well ahead of your time, and I notice you've delightfully left that open for a sequel for the 1980 to 2017 instalment. So, look, thank you very much. And I can only imagine, pre-Google, the amount of time that's taken you to research, some of that information from, well over 100 years ago. So thank you very much. Look, to our next speaker, and again briefly, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Joan Webster. Joan has been the RBWH Nursing Director of Research since 1991 and a recognised leader in hospital-based nursing and midwifery research, and has published in numerous peer-reviewed journals. To that end, and in recent years, Joan has been awarded, pause for dramatic effect, over $10 million in research grants, including not 1 or 2, but 7 NHMRC project grants. She collaborates with universities and hospitals across Queensland, Australia, and internationally. Joan's research in wound management, pressure ulcer prevention, and intravenous access is regularly cited in the literature and the guidelines, including national infection prevention guidelines in the UK and USA governments. As well as being a member of the RBWH Human Research Ethics Committee's Scientific Subcommittee and Research Advisory Committee, Joan is instrumental in organising the annual Healthcare Symposium, which we enjoyed only a few weeks ago. Joan introduces and coordinates an evidence-based practice training program for RBWH nurses and midwives, providing advice and training in all aspects of the research process. In her presentation tonight, Joan will trace the history of nursing and midwifery research here at the RBWH, or here at the Royal Brisbane Hospital and the Royal Women's Hospital, to get that right, from its early beginnings in the 1980s and the influence it now has internationally. So please welcome in, or join me in welcoming Joan Webster.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk this evening on the history of nursing research in the Royal Brisbane Hospital and the Royal Women's Hospital. But I must say that when Alanna asked me to do this talk, she had absolutely no idea that I was rubbish at history. In fact, it was my worst subject. To be good at history, one needs to have a good memory for names, places, dates. And as my colleagues would attest, this is not one of my strong points. Maths was my best subject at school. It had a logic to it that I understood. And I had an amazing English teacher that taught me the beauty of words and how to construct a coherent sentence and the logic of grammar. These are topics that have served me well over my lifetime, and particularly during the time that I've been a researcher, when one needs to be around statistics and writing for publications and proposals. So back to my dilemma about being rubbish at history. So where does one go to but to Mr. Google for inspiration? But this quote from Theodore Roosevelt didn't really cut it for me. I wasn't particularly interested in the past, and I was sure that there wouldn't be many texts or other documents that would help me prepare this talk. But then I found this quote. The past is where you learn the lessons, the future is where you apply the lessons. It reminded me of how one builds a track record in research, moving from novice to expert. It prompted me to think about where I'd been at the beginning of my research career and where I was now, and in fact where the history of nursing research at the Royal Brisbane and Royal Women's Hospital was at the beginning and where they are now, and how the evolution of nursing research could form the structure for this talk, which at the beginning I had absolutely no idea how to write. And then there was this. But the text indicated that I would need to depend on primary sources, such as diaries, correspondence, letters, etc., or secondary sources, which are materials that are produced after the time in question. The only sources that I could think of, the only primary sources that I could think of were research papers that were published, and a couple of, four in fact, histories, reports of research that were written of the Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital. The only secondary sources that I could think of were the history of the Royal Brisbane Hospital and the history of the Royal Women's Hospital. So I decided to break the history up into three sections, or four actually it's going to be, because as you know, the Royal Brisbane and the Royal Women's Hospital were completely separate structures up until 2003. They had their own executive teams, their own staff, their own policy and procedures, and consequently there was very little communication between the two campuses. And in fact, the only position that moved between the two hospitals was the infection control sister. It was a fact that had enormous implications for the development of research, as you'll see, at the Royal Women's Hospital. And throughout the presentation, I'll just provide some examples which will show you the development of nursing research at the hospital from its beginnings to its current mature stage. So, what is nursing research? Well, nursing research is no different from any other research. It's a systematic and reproducible method of discovering new knowledge. And as with all other disciplines, we use all sorts of methodologies, from laboratory studies, surveys, cohort studies, randomised controlled trials, and importantly, implementation research, which is the science of translating research into practice. Of course, translating research into practice is not easy, but improving patient outcomes by basing practice on best evidence should surely be the end goal of all our healthcare research. So that's what nursing research is, but why is it needed? Well, if you went to buy a new appliance or a new car, and the salesperson said to you, well, we don't actually know if it works, but there's a theoretical possibility that it might, you'd be somewhat confused. We know that around 30% of medical research is underpinned by good research evidence, but we're less clear about the evidence base for nursing research. So if we look at something very basic, like the evidence for prevention and treatment of pressure ulcers, we can look at the 558 recommendations in the recently published International Guidelines for Pressure Ulcer Prevention and Treatment. And we find that only 6 or 10% of the recommendations are underpinned by level A evidence. All of these 6 are Cochrane reviews. But when I took a look at the Cochrane reviews, 5 of them concluded there was insufficient evidence to inform practice. So there are a further 68 lower level studies, all of which require further work before the evidence is considered strong. And I must say the lack of evidence for pressure ulcer treatment and management is not alone. This applies to most of what nursing does, a very low evidence base. So we've taken a different look at evidence for nursing practice and we can look at evidence-based practice training program. Nurses and midwives bring a question to the evidence-based practice program. They undertake a systematic review of existing evidence for their practice question, and we find there that about 18% of their questions are able to be answered. that make them decide whether something should be done or not done. For example, here's one review that said it's safe to bed rest patients for less than 3 hours compared with greater than 3 hours, which is standard practice at our hospital, following an angiograph. And here's another that shows that a very simple intervention like making an SMS call showed a significant reduction in non-attendance rates. However, to be able to perform a systematic review, one needs to find some published evidence to incorporate into the review. And here's the problem. For every nurse or midwife that comes to our program, they struggle through about 4 to 5 questions before they can find any question at all, any problem at all that's got any evidence, any published evidence at all to put into their systematic review. So if we multiply the 93 systematic reviews here by 4, we found that only about 4.5% of all nursing practice is underpinned by any evidence at all. So if anyone asks me why I do nursing research, I think the answer's evident. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's get back to the history. And first we'll look at the history of the Royal Brisbane Hospital from 1980 up until 2003, and I'm sorry about the picture. It's the hospital in demise. As I said before, the hospitals had separate structures, and at the time the Royal Brisbane Hospital had a small research division, and early on there was actually a joint position between the Royal Brisbane Hospital and QUT. I'm pretty sure the incumbent at the time was Deanne Gaskell, but I couldn't find any published papers by Deanne around that time that involved the Royal Brisbane Hospital. The position was actually abolished after a couple of years by, I think, the then Director of Nursing, Joan Winter, because she didn't see sufficient value in the position for it to continue. There were others involved in the unit, but although there was some produced at the time, they were mostly concerned with quality improvement and education about how to do research. They were also the gatekeepers of research. I can remember attending a meeting over there once and finding out that every research proposal had to go through the unit for vetting before it could go up to the ethics committee. And I think that many nurses just got turned off because it was too difficult. But I don't really have an informed view about that time. I didn't work at that hospital. I was over at the Royal Women's. So let's go to the evidence. Let's go to the evidence from the primary source for the Royal Brisbane Hospital. These are some of the papers that were published up until 2003. And I don't know whether you can see, but by the titles, you can see that the Royal Brisbane Hospital research nurses were very much into introspection. Much of the research focused on nurses, exploring their beliefs and perceptions, and using mostly qualitative methodologies. Many of the papers didn't include subjects at all. They were theoretical papers or commentaries. The focus on qualitative research was mostly because nursing academics at that time were greatly influenced by postmodernist psychologists like Foucault and Husserl. They used words like ontological hermeneutics and existential disidentification to try to understand the world of nursing. And of course, there was no money for research, and nurses were cheap and available. There was one exception to this paradigm. Amanda Henderson was appointed to the role of nursing supervisor for research in the mid-1990s, and along with Wendy Zernike, they concentrated more on patient outcomes. Wendy conducted, in fact, the first randomised controlled trial by any Royal Brisbane Hospital nurse in 1997. It was a small trial of 47 participants, I think, that was looking at an intervention to prevent heel pressure ulcers. In the 23 years from 1980 to 1993, 20 papers were published by RBWH nurses that I could find. They were all published in nursing journals. The investigators were all nurses, and the majority were single author publications. So to get a more informed, more detailed information about what was going on at the time, I went to my go-to secondary source, the history of the Royal Brisbane Hospital. However, in this 455-page book, I found a few photos of matrons, a photo of Sister Elizabeth Kenny, who you've referred to, with an explanation about her approach to treating polio, and 14 lines under the heading Nursing. Not a word about nursing research. So over to the Royal Women's Hospital. And now I'm on home ground. And yes, the next part of the history is going to be mostly about me. Four significant events, it's a young Joan Webster up there. Four significant events shaped the history of nursing research at the Royal Women's Hospital. The first was that a new position was created for an infection control sister, a position that my then Executive Director of Nursing, Rhonda Middleton, asked me to fill. It was definitely the start of my research career and the start of nursing research at the Royal Women's Hospital. I was extremely fortunate to have a very supportive infection control committee with dedicated and inspiring leaders such as Richard Kemp and Joan Fagoli, who encouraged me to use the position to gather data and to test interventions. Our surgical site infection rate following caesarean section was very high at the time, so in my first major study, I prospectively evaluated over 1,500 women to identify risk factors for postnatal depression, for risk factors for post-caesarean section surgical site infection. The data was very useful to the Infection Control Committee. They instigated a number of interventions, including providing each surgeon or obstetrician with their own surgical site infection rates. The study was published in the ANZ Journal of Obs and Gynae in 1998. We were also concerned about the development of MRSA in our nursery. The first case was, this was in the neonatal intensive care nursery. The first case was identified in 1987 after we stopped using Pfizer Hex for hand washing and for washing babies. The active ingredient in Pfizer Hex was hexachlorophene, which was particularly useful against Staphylococcus aureus, a gram-positive organism. Pfizer Hex was replaced at the time with Hibiclens, which was a chlorhexidine-based product that was a more broad-spectrum antiseptic. To try to solve the MRSA problem, we followed almost 1,600 neonates and recorded the natural history of the outbreak of MRSA and the strategies that were used to try to control the spread. And we published our findings in the Journal of Paediatrics and Child Health in 1990. And based on these strategies, we managed to eliminate MRSA completely from the nursery by 1992. But as with many discoveries, the elimination of MRSA was more by chance than design. The midwives and neonatal nurses in the intensive care nursery had been complaining to me as the infection control sister that they were having chapped and reddened hands in the winter from the Hibiclens. And there was a new product on the market at the time, triclosan. It was supposedly gentle on hands, and it was also, its active ingredient was also hexachlorophene, which was the same active ingredient that was in Pfizer Hex. We started a 3-month trial, and as you can see by the graph, I haven't got a pointer, but you can see by the graph, after triclosan was introduced, MRSA disappeared completely. After the 3-month trial, we went back to using Hibiclens, and almost immediately MRSA returned. Triclosan was reintroduced for hand washing, and within several months, MRSA disappeared again. And apart from eliminating MRSA, we also found that we had a 5-fold reduction in the cost of vancomycin. It just shows the importance of hand washing, everybody. The next important event was the introduction of a new career structure in 1991. Executive directors of nursing were able to appoint positions based on the number of staff and the number of beds in their hospital. And Rhonda Middleton at the Royal Women's Hospital and the Executive Director of Nursing at the PA PAH hospital both created a position for a nursing director or a nursing supervisor for research. The Royal Brisbane Hospital did it a little later. So being a known insider and with something of a track record, I was a bit of a laid down misere for the position, which I took up the same year. At the time, my CEO, Dr. Jean Colley, encouraged me to collaborate with clinicians from other disciplines and take a broader view of women's health. We were working in a women's hospital and I'd been focusing on infection control, but she encouraged me to take a broader view of women's health. And one of the areas of particular interest was domestic violence in pregnancy. And we were among the first in the country to turn the spotlight on this important problem. Our initial prevalence study or incidence study it really was, of over 1,000 women published in MJ in 1994 found that around 9% of the women attending our antenatal clinic were prepared to admit to abuse, and about a third of these women had to receive medical treatment for their injuries. We followed the incident study with a chart review to see what happened, to have a look what the histories of these women were, and we found that there was an increase in antidepressants, increase in rate of asthma, epilepsy, greater than 2 miscarriages, greater than 2 terminations, greater incidence of neonatal death, and a higher incidence of hospital admission compared to those who didn't admit to abuse. This body of work led to a collaboration with Susan Strategos, who was the then Director of Women's Health and responsible to the Minister for Women's Affairs. We were part of a team that introduced a statewide rollout of something called the Domestic Violence Initiative, which involved training midwives and nurses to ask about domestic violence in the antenatal clinic, and it was the beginning of all Queensland women being screened for violence in pregnancy. Two reports were produced for the Minister at the time. One of them was a comprehensive review of the project, an evaluation, I should say, rather than a review. The initiative also led to a very proud moment for Susan and I when we went to Canberra together to receive this award from Amanda Vanstone. It's really impossible to mention all the research that went on in those years, but there was also a very large body of important work around postnatal depression. The work involved a multidisciplinary team, including psychiatrist John Linnane and social workers Jan Hinson and Susan Starenberg. During the 1990s, we began a trial. We began screening for women for risk factors for postnatal depression in their antenatal at the antenatal clinic, and we subsequently followed 900 of these women postnatally and found that those with risk factors antenatally were 2.5 times more likely to develop postnatal depression. We were able to offer referral pathways for these women, and domestic violence screening and postnatal depression screening became routine at our hospital following those studies. Around this time, I also became very interested in evidence-based practice. I've already mentioned our current evidence-based practice program, but it actually started back in about 1998. Viv Gildard's in the audience somewhere, and she reminds me that she was around at that time. Thanks, Viv. I became increasingly interested in what is now called low-value care, and discovered the Cochrane collaboration. I published my first Cochrane review in 1993 with Margot Pritchard. It was a review of wearing gowns in neonatal nurseries, but although it was pretty easy to do the systematic review, it's much harder to change practice. I should also mention, for those of you who know her, that in the early 2000s, Victoria Holt came to work for me on a voluntary basis, and we eventually got her a part-time position in the unit. Me and her, that's all there was. And just in case you were wondering, my secondary source for the history of research at the Royal Women's Hospital was more informative than the Royal Brisbane history was. It was noted that Sister Webster has had a growing interest in nursing research and has made an outstanding contribution, So, the next important step that happened, or event that happened in the development of research at this hospital was the amalgamation of the two hospitals. Amanda Henderson, who was the nursing director for research at the Royal Brisbane Hospital at the time, decided to jump ship and go over to the PAH as the nursing director for education, and Mary Montgomery, who was the ED&S at the time, asked me if I would take on the role of nursing director for the Royal Brisbane and the Royal Women's Hospital. This took me well out of my comfort zone from focusing on women's issues and infection control, but I figured that research was research, and there would always be content experts around to help me with things that I didn't understand. A position was also created for a nurse researcher, and Rosemary Blythe was the initial incumbent, and Sonia Osborne took over after her. So then there were three: Victoria, Sonia and me. Around that time, I also met Claire Rickard. I was one of her PhD supervisors, and her PhD topic was in the area of IV access. It was the beginning of a very long-term and very important collaboration and friendship. Another important event that happened in 2003 was when a joint professorial position was created between QUT and the Royal Brisbane Hospital, with Glenn Gardner being the incumbent. This appointment triggered a whole burst of new research activity among Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital nurses. And 2003 was also the year that I received my first Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital Research Foundation grant, a grant that was going to set the course for much of the important work in the area of IV access that I've been involved in with my colleague Claire Rickard. And here's an example of that collaboration. Claire and I were both investigating the impact of routinely changing IV catheters, peripheral IV catheters, every 3 days, compared with only changing when there was a clinical indication to do so. The question came initially from one of my evidence-based practice students who'd come from another hospital where catheters weren't changed every 3 days. Claire and I both published highly cited papers on the subject, and consequently, along with Sonia Osborne, we published a Cochrane systematic review on the topic, which showed that there was absolutely no difference in outcomes, in any of the outcomes that we measured, between changing every 3 days or changing a catheter when it's only clinically indicated. So, now I've nearly run out of time. So I'm just going to dot point a few other points in the history of development, a few facts here on the screen. In 2008, Alanna Geary appointed the first ever service line nurse researcher in cancer care. The appointment completely turned around the culture among nurses in cancer care services, and the research output, initially by Ray Chan and later by Nicole Gavin and Elise Button, has been absolutely outstanding. In late 2011, 2 nursing professorial units were established with in-kind contributions from the hospital and from QUT. The first was in ICU with Professor Fiona Coyer, and the second in renal medicine with Professor Anne Bonner. And more recently, Professor Patsy Yates heads up the professorial unit in cancer care. Although each of these appointments were honorary, the research outputs in terms of published papers, conference presentations, and completion of higher degrees by RBWH nurses has really exploded. In 2014, Glenn Gardner completed her contract with the Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital and was replaced by 2 joint professorial positions. Fiona Coyer was appointed to one of the positions, so her work in ICU was now being paid for. And Terry Green came to us from Canada, and her area of interest is neurosciences and stroke. During the period from 2003 till now, research nurses have published over 2,060 publications. Now that's probably an underestimation, but that's all that I could track down. We've also received over $12 million in research funding. You can see from this graph that our research income these are in 3-year blocks. From 2003 to 2005, our research income was about $100,000. That was just from small grants here and there. In the next 3 years, we received our first NHMRC grant of almost $430,000, and the income involving Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital nurses went up to over $700,000. But over the next 6 years, 6 more NHMRC grants were secured, averaging just over $5 million in each of the 3-year periods. This funding was largely due to my collaborations with academics from Griffith University, particularly Claire Rickard and Wendy Shaboya. This shot shows 7 of the 10 chief investigators from the first ever Centre for Research Excellence, NHMRC Centre for Research Excellence Award, 5-year grant for $2.5 million that was topped up by a further $1 million from the Griffith University. And this funding, along with other grants, has led to significant research in the areas of intravascular devices, pressure ulcer prevention and surgical site infection. I'd also like to acknowledge the amazing work of the 2 project managers that work in our unit, Emily Larson, who's here tonight, and Nicole Gavin, and without whom none of this work would be possible. I'd like to finish off by sharing information about nursing research from my other historical sources. In 2004, the then CEO Richard Olley commissioned the Ryan Report. This was the first of a number of reviews into research at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital, and he noted that nursing services were performing at well above average levels. This compared against several other departments who were performing at only above average levels, and where the majority of hospital departments were performing below average level. In 2007, the Peters report, Sir Frank Peters recognised the issues facing nursing research in terms of limited opportunities for funding, but noted, despite these limitations, that nursing research output was satisfactory. In 2009, an external review specifically of the Nursing Research Department noted that the research performance was outstanding and amongst the most productive nursing groups in Australia. But by 2010, on page 29 of the Campbell Report of current research, which was undertaken at a time when nursing research was very well established, the only mention of nursing came under the heading alignment of the research vision with practice. And it states that an appointment of a nurse manager has been made to act as a conduit between nursing researchers and senior nursing leaders. Does anybody know what that position is? Because I certainly don't. And I think that probably was a cut and paste from some other report that he prepared. Well, thank you for coming along this ride with me. Once I got started, I didn't know where to stop, and there are a great many gaps. But my trusty guide for writing history papers assures me that no work of history can ever pretend to be comprehensive. It will always be possible to reveal only part of the history. So the history should be based on selections of topics that seem most interesting, and I do hope you found that the case tonight. But finally, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank the Royal Brisbane and Women's Research Foundation for their continued support of research and for being the catalyst for so many careers in research. Thank you very much.
Look, thank you, Joan. Fascinating. And my favourite line of the night already. I'm sorry, but the rest of the presentation's about me. And so it should be, because of the absolutely substantial contribution. Look, moving on, Alanna Geary, First began working at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, immediately after completing her nursing training in 1984. In 1987, Alanna began midwifery training at the Royal Women's Hospital and returned to the Royal Brisbane Hospital in 1988 to work in surgery and subsequently orthopaedics and infection control. Prior to being appointed to her current role in 2015, Alanna was the Nursing Director in Cancer Care Services for just over 10 years. And this role evolved into her appointment as the Cancer Care Service Directorate Stream Lead for Nursing. Among her many achievements, Alanna most notably created the vision strategy and led the implementation of the Cancer Care Nursing Services Professorial Precinct, as we've just heard, and led the establishment of a dedicated cancer care nursing research unit, an initiative that was awarded a Premier's Award for Excellence in Leadership in 2014. In her presentation tonight, Alanna will look at the hospital's substantial nursing and midwifery service today and ask the question, actually, and Alanna, I hope you'll answer the question as well, where to from here? So please welcome the current Executive Director of Nursing here at the Royal and also Metro North.
I don't know if I can answer that question, but anyway. As Peter's just alluded to, 32 years ago I started here at what was then the Royal Brisbane Hospital. I was a hospital trained nurse, as Peter said, training at the Royal Gympie, not too much royal about Gympie, but anyway, we like to refer to it as that. And then subsequently was a hospital trained midwife. Choosing nursing and midwifery as a career choice, I have never ever come to regret. In my 35-year career, I have never once woken up and thought, I don't want to go to work. I love what I do, and I know that many of you share that passion for healthcare, but also the passion for the now RBWH. My aim in this presentation is to give you, and I forgot to put my PowerPoint on. There we go. My aim of this presentation is actually to give you an overview of nursing and midwifery as it is today, and how the workforce has stood the test of time, and is now, I believe, the lumbar vertebrae that keep the RBWH upright. It gives me great pleasure to be standing here in front of you today as the Executive Director of Nursing and Midwifery Services, RBWH, and Metro North Hospital and Health Service. The Royal, as we all affectionately call it, has undergone significant change over time that I've been here. Not only the physical structure, but in service delivery models, advances in clinical care, significant developments, as Joan has just alluded to, in nursing and midwifery research, changes in nursing and midwifery positions, functions, and roles. Moving along through the years, I feel extremely honoured and privileged to be leading such a wonderful group of nurses and midwives across the Royal and Metro North. There are 3,500 nurses and midwives at the Royal Brisbane, and across Metro North, which encompasses RBWH, Prince Charles Hospital, Redcliffe, Caboolture, Kilcoy, Community, Indigenous, Subacute Services, Woodford Corrections and Oral Health Services, there are in excess of 7,500 nurses and midwives. I continue to be astounded by the depth of talent, the collective intellect of the nursing and midwifery workforce within the Hospital and Health Service, and I am, of course, especially proud of the Royal and all that it stands for. I am in awe of the nurses and midwives at the coalface, of the educators, the researchers, and of the specialist nurses and midwives. I am proud of that we are such a vital component of the multidisciplinary team, and in many instances are the glue that keeps those teams together. That in 2016, what we provide is contemporary, evidence-based, and contributes so significantly to the outcomes for patients and the clients in our care. Nursing and midwifery has evolved. It is a very different to the Royal of old. It is a very different Royal to the one I commenced in 32 years ago. But the fabric, the essence of why we come to work, the patients we care for, and the values we uphold are no different. The nurse or midwife in 2016 may have trained just a little differently to how those of us who completed a hospital-based qualification did. In 1981, when I commenced my hospital-based training, I was trained to do tasks. I was trained to keep the patients clean and comfortable, to look after the IV or the IDC, to help the patient to mobilise, to give medications, to feed, to bathe, to comfort. All of those things are still relative and true, but the nurse today does all of those things and more. The nurse today provides dialysis with highly technical machines, and he or she does not only know how the machine works or which buttons to push, they understand the pathophysiology behind the machine, the effects on the renal system, and the short and long-term effects of fluid overload. The cancer care nurse understands the blood results of the patient they are administering chemotherapy to, and despite having a medical prescription, will not deliver the chemotherapy if the blood tests indicate otherwise. The cancer care nurse understands the number of fractions of radiation to be delivered to the patient undergoing radiation therapy, and informs the radiation therapist and medical staff of the patient's side effects and the best way to manage the patient in the radiation suite. The newer roles of the nurse practitioner prescribe treatment and medication and work alongside our medical colleagues. Care is overseen but not directed by a medical officer. They are independent practitioners and run independent and isolated clinics with minimal medical intervention. As we move into the new millennium, we have nurses and midwives as very much part of the decision-making for the patient and their carers. The nurse or midwife's role in healthcare is not a passive one, but a decision-maker, an advocate, a clinician, a researcher, an educator, and a mentor to many other healthcare professionals. Nurses and midwives are educated, informed, clinical leaders who can take on new, exciting and contemporary roles, but keep nursing and caring as caring and compassionate healthcare professionals. I see my role as the Executive Director of Nursing and Midwifery Services to ensure future generations of nurses and midwives are all of those things, but share the compassion, the fun, the joy, the ups, the downs, and the sometimes pain that makes nursing and midwifery what it is. There are many new roles in nursing and midwifery in 2016. When I commenced my training, and then as a young new graduate at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, there were only a few classifications of nurses. There were the student and pupil nurses, there were the enrolled nurses, the registered nurses and midwives, the charge nurses, some of whom are in this room today, the nursing supervisors or the blockies, the deputy nursing superintendent, and the nursing superintendent. Today we have undergraduate nursing and midwifery students, postgraduate nursing and midwifery students, new graduate nurses and midwives, registered nurses, clinical nurse consultants, nurse and midwifery unit managers, nurse and midwifery managers, nurse and midwifery educators, nurse researchers, clinical trials nurses, case managers, care coordinators, nurse navigators, advanced practice nurses, nurse practitioners, assistant nursing and nursing directors, and directors of nursing and midwifery. In the registered nurse and midwifery stream, there are in excess of 20 different registered nursing and midwifery pay points, and then in addition, pay points for additional qualifications. While nursing and midwifery care has certainly evolved significantly in the past 150 years, since the first graduating class of the Nightingale Training School at St Thomas's in 1865, I would like to think that the ethos of caring, compassion and commitment is still at the forefront of our thinking processes. Florence Nightingale set us on the trajectory of education that has stood us in good stead, and today the nurse of 2016 is highly educated but still espouses the virtues of caring and compassion. A colleague said to me recently, a good nurse is educated but has the social and emotional intelligence to take it to a level where no other health professional can. I could not agree more. We are poised perfectly at the bedside to make a difference. It is interesting times in healthcare. Our patients, of course, live longer with diseases that many years ago meant certain or imminent death. We maintain life and provide support for the very ill, the chronically ill and the dying, and there is often much discussion about futile care. The term futile care is bandied around constantly these days. It implies that the treatment is not going to work, that the chemotherapy for cancer is of no use, or mechanical ventilation of a patient should not be offered to prolong life. The concept of futile care always will cause much conjecture and significant debate. And I don't believe for 1 minute that I'm an expert on the subject. And what I will say, though, is while the treatment may be futile, the care never is. And that, colleagues, is still the core of my profession. Nurses and midwives care. We have that unique ability to and the absolute privilege to be at the patient long after our medical and allied health care colleagues have left the bedside. Their input is vital, there's no denying that, but nurses and midwives provide the bedside care, whether that care is in the acute care setting, the subacute setting, the primary health setting, or the community setting. So in 2016, what makes a good nurse or midwife? What is it that makes us tick, that gets us out of the bed in the morning or at 11 o'clock at night for a night shift? Why do so many of us stay in the profession for so many years, loving it as much now as we did as fresh-faced graduates? I can't really answer that. So what is it that maketh the nurse or the midwife? What makes us so different? Well, I actually researched the top 10 qualities of a nurse or midwife, and it wasn't actually that difficult to find, and this is what Google tells me. Empathy, attention to detail, communication, intuition, physical endurance, emotional stability, that's a bit dodgy, critical thinking, patience, coordination skills, and dedication. And I've added an 11th, an amazing bladder capacity. Although as I go into my 50s, I'm questioning that. So if one has all of these skills, does what that make one the best nurse? If they only have some, are they not such a good nurse? Are we born to be nurses? Can we be educated to be nurses? I don't believe I can answer these questions. But what is important is that I and my colleagues, as nurse and midwifery leaders, make our workforce of today and tomorrow armed with the appropriate ammunition to ensure that we can meet the challenges of our profession head-on. We need to have educated thinking nurses and midwives at the bedside, and we need an appropriate skilled workforce who can take us to the next level. Think of some of the patients that you have provided care to during your career here at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. We all have them, the one or several patients or their family that stood apart for a reason, the one who made you cry, the one who made you laugh, the one who was a little bit more difficult than most, the one who you were with for a significant amount of time and really just became friends with, the patient who was particularly challenging or was particularly wonderful. We can all remember patients who will leave indelible marks on us. But what I often say to new graduate nurses and midwives is that while they leave indelible marks on you, so do you on them. They will remember the midwife who sat beside their bed and showed them how to attach a baby to the breast to get along the breastfeeding journey that they so desired. They will remember the nurse or midwife who sat with them while mum was dying. They remember the nurse or midwife, allied health professional or doctor who laughed with them, who cried with them, who talked them through a difficult diagnosis and interpreted the difficult lingo that we tend to use. We as health professionals are just as important to our patients as they are to us. It's absolutely a two-way street. And nurses and midwives in 2016 are no different to my grandmother, who was a nurse in 1950. The nurses in 2016 just make sure that there's evidence behind the care provided. I put that in for Joan. That the research supports the pressure relieving device that is being used, that the IV is changed according to what the research suggests, and the thinking nurse of 2016 reviews the patient in the context of that research and changes the care pathway to meet the patient requirements based on sound evidence-based practice. Nurses and midwives no longer just stand beside the bedside. They are independent thinkers and masters of their craft. Our critical thinking, our analytical brains, our demonstrable processing ability, communication skills, our teamwork ability, and our understanding of the healthcare system make us the perfect multidisciplinary team member. To provide some context around that, for those of you who may have left the organisation several years ago, RBH is such a large and complex organisation these days. It is a big business with an operating budget of in excess of $980 million, and each one of those dollars is a challenge. Because of that, it is divided into what we could know as clinical service lines: surgical and perioperative services, critical care, women's and newborn services, mental health, cancer care, and internal medicine. Each one of these clinical service lines has a nursing director and an executive director. In days gone by, executive directors were largely doctors. In 2016, the executive director of internal medicine services is a nurse. The executive director of women's and newborn services is a nurse/midwife. The executive director of medical imaging services is a nurse/midwife. The executive director of Redcliffe Hospital is an RBWH trained nurse. The Executive Director of Prince Charles Hospital is a nurse. And in many service lines and facilities, when the Executive Director is on leave, it is the Nursing Director or the Director of Nursing and Midwifery Services who steps in to do the role. I myself has actually acted as the Executive Director of the Royal Brisbane. The inaugural chair of the RBWH Clinical Council was a nurse, and although she has recently handed over the baton, she maintains active involvement with other nurses and midwives on the Clinical Council. Can I also point out that our Chief Executive in Metro North, Associate Professor Ken Whelan, is also a nurse. And 3 of our current Hospital and Health Service Board members have nursing backgrounds, 2 of whom trained at RBH. So what makes a nursing and midwifery leader at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital? The nurse or midwife at the bedside who finds himself in a situation that is less than ideal and takes the lead, directs the flow, organises others. A good nurse and midwifery leader feels confident in a situation. They have a sense of what is right and they keep that as a pivot point for all that they do. Effective leaders have a high regard for others and they see positive aspects of the situation and of others. Good leaders make others feel good about themselves and create positive team environments, and I believe that's what the nurse and midwifery leaders at Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital do. Nurses remain one of the most trusted professions. Being an effective nurse or midwifery leader is not about telling others what to do, it is about inspiring others and then supporting them to be their best. Ronald Reagan once said, "The greatest leader is not necessarily the one who does the greatest things. He is the one who gets the people to do the greatest things." The positive nurse and midwifery leaders I have seen at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital support their teams and recognise the efforts of that team. A good leader says thank you. A good leader listens and allows the thoughts and views of many to be put into action. Leaders provide clarity, confidence, and inspire trust. Nursing and midwifery leadership is no exception, and those virtues are what make nurses and midwives in 2016 the valuable leaders at RBWH. So what is the future of nursing and midwifery services? What is it in our space that we can and should inform and influence for those of you who work as nurses and midwives in days gone by, and those who are not here today have left an amazing legacy. And it's my job and all nurses and midwives to take our profession to the next level. In 2016, we as nurses and midwives are a self-governing workforce. We are regulated by our own profession, and Elaine alluded to some of the professional issues that some of our other disciplines have gone through. We work as a team, and many of us with many, and we are equal partners. As a collective group, we set the scene, we inform the practice, we lead by example, we manage our workforce, hopefully, and we set our own goals and aspirations. I see our profession at Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital poised to take on some of its biggest challenges. We have contemporary data that suggests that nurses are going to be in short supply in the future, so it is my job, and that of people in similar roles, to make sure we grow our workforce within a financially and fiscally responsible matrix. Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital is the largest facility in Queensland and the largest hospital and health service in the country need to actually think of this. We have to think outside the box. How do we get as many nurses and midwives into our profession, and how do we make them into competent, capable and experienced individuals who can work in our teams? These are our future workforce. University education and the models that have subsequently been developed for undergraduate and then postgraduate education are evolving, and the RBWH will continue to ensure that the nurse or midwife who comes to work now as a new graduate is an educated, thinking individual who just needs a few short months to put their experiences and theory into practice and become valued, capable, competent, and confident registered or enrolled nurses and midwives. I would like to point out that the nurse or midwife today is not content, and nor should they be, to finish their training and call the education journey over. Nurses and midwives in 2016 have the knowledge and the tools, and we have bright, career-driven, capable individuals provided to us that we as leaders need to inspire. The RBWH needs these individuals to enable us to shine as the wonderful training, educational, research and clinical facility it has always been and will continue to be if we do it right. Mother Teresa said, "You can do what I cannot do. I can do what you cannot do. Together we can do great things. To me, that epitomises nursing and midwifery as part of the multidisciplinary team. Collectively, in our teams, in our HHS, in the state, in Australia and globally, we can achieve much. We have provided the grounding, we are building on the foundations, the healthcare professionals of tomorrow will build the building, and beyond the future healthcare graduates of all disciplines will raise the roof. As a 35-year veteran of the nursing and midwifery profession, I challenge you to think about the future. Think about the profession for which you work. Think about the future of our organisations. As individuals, I challenge new graduates and experienced professionals to seek opportunity, develop and hone skills, seek out role models, mentors, and people to inspire. I think over my career and who my mentors have been and are. Some of them are sitting in this room today. Some have been my direct line managers, some of whom are from disciplines outside of nursing and midwifery, Roger Allison and Amanda Dimes, and some have even had reporting lines to me. But they will always be the people who inspire me, who have challenged me and keep me honest and true to self and the healthcare profession. Each one of my mentors has been that for a very different reason. I hope as I spearhead nursing and midwifery services at RBWH and with the other nurse leaders at this organisation, we take RBWH to the next level on the worldwide health stage. 2016 and moving into 2017 is a time of great challenge, but it is also a time of great excitement for the RBWH. New services, new models of care, new roles for healthcare professionals generally, but including nurses and midwives, bedside clinical and administrative roles, education and research roles, support roles, and clinical expertise roles. RBWH will continue to lead the way nationally on the education and research stage for nursing and midwifery, and Joan's presentation has been testament to that. There is so much history at the RBWH and so much promise for the future. We have a new executive both within the RBWH but also the healthcare service as a collective who are committed to moving the organisation forward. It is our time, but for you in the room, never lose sight of why you chose your profession. I speak to you today as a very passionate nurse, but I also speak to you as a passionate healthcare professional and a person who is absolutely, categorically and without reserve loyal to the Royal. For those of us who are currently employed by the RBWH, regardless of discipline, now is our time. We have challenges, we have hurdles, and we have wide caverns to cross to meet our inevitable targets. Remember, we can't change the direction of the wind, but we can always adjust our sails to reach our destination. The wonderful RBWH will be 150 years old next year. We should be so proud of that heritage and our wonderful history. But we need to make the next 150 years count also. Joan and Elaine have very articulately, and I can't say it now, my mouth is very dry, given us their overviews of where we have been. I hope I've given an overview of where we should head and how we can lead the next generation of healthcare professionals. But never lose sight of why we are here, and that is the patients in our care. I'm going to leave you with a short video, if I can find it again. Which has actually been developed by Metro North, which I believe personifies what we do in healthcare. And the reason we do what we do is because we care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Apologies for running a few minutes over time. Clearly I won't be asked to do this again. But please join me in thanking again our speakers tonight. A wonderful reflection on the past, and Alanna, in yourself and your team, we're in terrific hands, I think, for the future as well. Elaine, thank you again for coming back. You mentioned in your presentation in the 1970s we used to have a few delays here in getting our brain injured patients over to PA. Some things never change, unfortunate to say. And I did see Cliff and Kim, I don't know whether they're still here, in the audience before our current board members. There's Cliff. Cliff, wonderful to hear, isn't it, that the board members used to get written to directly from the staff asking for pay rises. I can see your sigh of relief that doesn't happen anymore. Or maybe it does, and I've got to get on that bandwagon. I'll talk to you later. Look, I would also like to thank again finally our sponsors, QSuper and QBank, for their ongoing support. And just a final, I think, plug, I guess, for the alumni. And if we could continue to spread the word about the alumni to our past and also our current staff in helping us to bring these sorts of events together. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much again for your attendance tonight, and have a safe trip home. Well done, Elaine. It's terrific.
I'm not sure whether this sound system, I have hearing aids now.
Oh, is it? Yeah. Well, look, we could hear you fine. And the other speakers as well. So certainly. So, thank you. Yeah. You can't speak. Three women tonight. Great. Elaine, how did you find out that information? And where did you get them? Really? They've got a library.
See you, Mark. Thanks for the chat.
The certificate of Massachusetts trained by Now, she was Harold Crawford's close associate for many, many years. She had her room on the other side of the passage. One of the most famous papers, she was, and Rose Crawford was her father. She had the front ribs in his coat. Harold Crawford was across the dressing room.
I mean, Harold was serious.
He fixed my arm.
Good to see you.